Good evening. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs here at NASAR, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. And thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us, either in person at our Vartan Gregorian building or online. This is an opportune moment, I hope, for me to remind everyone that the work we do at NASAR, including but not limited to hosting, organizing, and co-sponsoring more than 60 events during this calendar year across the United States, as well as in Europe and Armenia, is supported and indeed made possible by with the support of our members and donors. We thank you for your generous support of our work. If you are not a NASAR member, please consider making this the night that you become one. As a little added inducement tonight, we will raffle off a copy of an outstanding book, The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918, by tonight's speaker, Dr. Khatchig Mouradian, to a NASAR member. If you are already a NASAR member and you're here in person, we just need you to legibly sign in and provide us with your contact information. If you are a NASAR member attending on Zoom, we already have your contact information, and you may consider yourself entered. If you're watching live on YouTube, send us an email at hq@nasar.org before the end of the program tonight saying you're a NASAR member and you'd like to participate in the raffle. Yes, but what if you are not a NASAR member, you ask? It's really very simple. Join now, and you will qualify. We will notify the winner tomorrow. Is this clear? Okay. Have I over-explained? Okay, I fear I may have over-explained, but nevertheless. I would like to also announce that our next event here at the NASAR building will be on Thursday, December 5th, which will be also the night of our Christmas open house. So there will be a special sale on all items in the bookstore and refreshments and merriment of various kinds, we hope. You can visit the library, tour the building, and we will have a lecture that evening as well, presented by two young scholars visiting from Yerevan, from the American University of Armenia, Hayarpi Papikyan and Rafik Santrosian, who will speak about Yekaterina Bahudarian, a forgotten writer and dramatist from Artsakh, a subject about which I'll wager none of us know anything, and I am very interested to hear about this. Please join us. Tonight's program is, as I hope you are already aware, being held in memory of, and I would add in honor of, Shushan Yeni-Komshian Teager, our dear friend, NASAR board member, and all-around remarkable human being whom we lost on August 6th of this year. The announcement for tonight's event has these words. Shushan Teager was born in Beirut, Lebanon in 1931 to Helen Shushan Yeni-Komshian of Aintab and Dr. Hovsep Yeni-Komshian of Kilis. A long-serving member of NASAR's board of directors, she was also a dedicated volunteer and invaluable resource at NASAR's Mouradian Library, where she took a special interest in raising awareness of the collection of Houshamadeans and acted as unofficial ambassador while selflessly offering her own time, knowledge, and fluency in several languages in order to assist researchers. That is all true, but there is, of course, a whole lot more that can be said. Shushan had degrees in chemistry and chemical engineering. She was a scientist who worked with her husband, Professor Herb Teager, on groundbreaking research in the speech and hearing sciences. She was a loving and dedicated parent, grandparent, and sibling. She was incredibly knowledgeable in many, if not most, aspects of Armenian history, language, literature, and theology. She researched and documented her own impressive family's history in the book, The Krajians of Aintab. She traveled the world and was what used to be called a cultured person. She was funny, stubborn, and we really miss her a lot. She loved NASAR and she loved our library. And she loved sharing her knowledge with visiting researchers and me and everybody who came here. After Shushan's passing, one of the first thoughts that came to me was that we need to have an event in her memory. That was obvious. And I had just recently read a draft version of an article that Khatchig Mouradian had written titled Recreating Home in Exile, the Armenian Memory Book as Art, Artifact, and Roadmap, which will appear very soon in the journal Wasafiri in a special issue on Armenians. And this was so clearly aligned with Shushan's interests and enthusiasms and knowledge that I asked Khatchig if he would be willing to give this talk, and he kindly accepted. For a long time, she took a special interest in Nasser's sizable collection of these publications, about which we will hear tonight. She lamented their neglect by scholars. She encouraged their use and their rediscovery, as you see here, and helped Nasser to expand our collection and urged us to create a special space for them in the library. In the old building, that wasn't particularly feasible, but when the time came to plan this new building and the library space, Shushan strongly advocated for a Houshamadean area and gave generously to support it, and thus it bears her name and always will. Nasser's library curator, Ani Babayan, has created a display of a few examples from our collection here at the front of the room, and we invite you to check them out afterwards, but not to touch them. I would like to invite Shushan's son, Daniel Teager, to the mic to say a few words, and also to recognize her son and Daniel's brother, Stephen, who is with us tonight as well. Stephen, would you wave? Daniel.
It's very tall. So, Mark, first of all, nobody calls me Daniel, except my mom when I did something wrong. Thank you so much. Everybody calls me Dan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm 100% Armenian. My grandfather changed the name to protect the innocent. And I'm the guy that plays the trumpet. When I was younger, it was Armenian trumpet boy. And now it's the old guy playing the trumpet. I joined a long line of Armenian trumpeters, started with me. And this is actually very, very luxurious. So my little contribution, pushing the culture forward, because I think we have to look forward, is two things. One is I started a salsa band, which is really fun, the world's only Armenian salsa band. And we used to have this running joke because I thought we could be supported by the Armenian community, but the Armenian community is really tough. So we'd play in clubs and stuff, and I'd ask, "We got Armenians out there?" It'd be dead silence. You could hear the crickets, and then I'd say, "Hi, Mom. Mom, great to see you." She was my #1 fan. The other contribution that I tried to make is to adapt a lot of Armenian sacred music to the trumpet, which really sounds great. Except for most of the community, it kind of goes over like a lead balloon. We have two instruments of choice, like most model minorities. That would be violin and piano. But trumpet, what is this trumpet? But you should hear it. At my mom's service, we did the entire Hokya Hankis on a brass choir, and she would have loved it. She would have loved this. And I can't thank Mark and Sylva enough for arranging this lecture in her memory. We are in a room that was given by my aunt Grace Yeni-Komshian. And then you spoke about the little niche of the library from my mom. My wife and I have also contributed as generously as we can. So someplace in this building there's some gold-plated doorstops or something that we gave money to. But I want to take you on a little bit of a journey to explain my relationship and my mother's relationship with Nasser. So on my part, I was introduced to the nuances of Armenian sacred music by a long-standing employee of Nasser, which is Sandra Jurigian. And Sandra Jurigian worked with Manug Young in the old days, back when Nasser was a lovely house very close to Longfellow Park in Harvard Square. So the first question is, how did my mother become so interested in Armenian history and these memory books in particular? And that goes back to my grandfather's oldest brother, Agobaha. He told a story which is rather relevant. And that story is that my grandfather would always say, I was born in 1895, the year of the Houshamadean massacre. And he was from Kilis. Now you'll notice that we have the Krejans of Aintab here. So perhaps there is a companion volume, the Yeni-Komshians of Kilis, which is a project that I believe she has left to me. And we do have an awful lot of the groundwork done for that. So her oldest brother told a story about how all the Armenians were gathered in 1895 when my grandfather was just an infant inside of the courtyard of a rather nice Turkish colleague, because Kilis was an Armenian town, and a Turkish nobleman took all the Armenians in. They were in his courtyard. And they were very, very quiet, because if they made any noise at all, then the mobs outside might break down the doors and kill everybody. And there was some consensus there, because my grandfather was an infant, to smother his life so that he wouldn't cry and betray them. And Agobaha said, no, he's a good baby. He'll behave. And he did. And later on, when my mom was older, she would go visit Agobaha. He was a lovely man. And he would tell her the family history, which is rather fascinating. I don't have time, do I, Mark? Jeez, you are a tough crowd, my God. Anyway, he would say to her, are you taking this down, my daughter? Write this down, because when I am gone, nobody will remember. And that stuck with her. She told those stories to me and my brother, and it sticks with us as well. So let's take a look a little bit, because Nasser has been a big part of our lives for a long, long time. Back in the bad old days, when Nasser was a house next to Longfellow Park in Harvard Square, this building was the headquarters of the John Birch Society, the first really big neoconservative movement in America, which later moved to the Midwest. And there they're spreading more joy and happiness. Nasser bought this building. So it was the former headquarters of John Birch. For a brief moment, it was also the home of a lab that did cutting-edge research in vocal fold physiology. Gosh, that's as tough to say as memory books, isn't it? Let's just go with voice print analysis. So my dad was an academic, and part of the reason that I am not an academic, neither is my brother. He's a pilot. Is that the coolest thing or what? A captain for Delta. He flies giant planes through the skies. I love that. Anyway, we knew firsthand just how vicious academia could be. And my father was pushed out of his laboratory when he was sick. So Nasser lent a hand to my mother and allowed us to rent a space so that my dad's lab could be here for a little bit. Now, Manug Young was not, how shall I put it? He was not into delegating responsibility easily. He built this place from the ground up. It was under his direction that they bought the old John Birch building. But he could also be, for lack of a better word, difficult. Now, for those of you who know my mother a little bit, you can close your eyes and imagine how charming she was, and she definitely was charming. But for those of you who know her really, really well, like my brother and me, you would be subject to some heated discussions of things that would get under her skin. I believe the technical term is venting. And there was one day in particular, I believe it was in the old building, not 100% sure, she had volunteered her time to go and put stamps on envelopes. We did that back in the old days before the internet. And so one by one, they were putting stamps on the envelopes, and one by one, Manug was inspecting them and making sure that the stamps were in exactly the right place. And my mother came home fit to be tied. You could see the steam coming out of the ears. It's just a mailing. We're doing our best. Why does he do this? And yet, my mother was the one who led the charge to have some sort of recognition of Manug Young. She wanted this building named after Manug Young. Personally, I was hoping that this building would be named after David Seville, also known as Ras Bagdasaryan, who gave us, among other great Armenian contributions to society, Theodore, Simon, and Alvin. Yes, but Nasser had other plans. And so my mother made sure that there was some recognition to this man who started Nasser and also drove her up the wall at every opportunity. So let's look at that for a sec, because it brings me to my big point. Something intangible about our relationship with Nasser, something that was very important to my mother, and that is heart. Now, I was here at the gala, and it was lovely, and all these scholars are getting tons and tons of money. Do you have anything for itinerant musicians there, Mark? Keep me in mind. I'll give you my CD for the music library. It makes a great coaster. Anyway, heart. Let's think about heart for a sec. My mother had a very warm and generous heart. As angry as she got with the board of Nasser, and we would hear about exactly how long some of these meetings took. I believe her word was interminable. As frustrated as she would be from time to time, she made sure that there was recognition of Manug Young. Nasser reached out to me through Sandra Jerigian, who was my guide to Armenian liturgical music. My mother took that heart and she gave a collection of books to the ACYOA, now at Holy Trinity Library. You can see her, no matter who came and showed an interest in her work, she would help them, regardless of nationality, regardless of how she felt about them personally, and they would never know if she didn't like them, but my brother and I certainly did. She was a heart of Nasser. So I like to think that the torch has been passed on to us. Yes, I am a member. Am I going to win the raffle? I'm dying to read your stuff, guy. But I don't think it's enough for this organization, because as organizations grow, they tend to lose heart. Right? So I think we should all take a brief moment to think about my mom and what she did for this organization, and also what this organization did for her. And not just be a giant memory book for all things Armenian, which indeed is wonderful. Not just do what we can to make sure that research continues worldwide, but reach out from inside and do nice things for each other, especially now when we seem to be polarized and meanness is the order of the day. So think of my mom, do something nice, and be generous. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dan. Well, that's all the time we have. No, I'm just kidding. He can dish it out and he can take it. So that brings us to tonight's speaker. Dr. Khatchig Mouradian is the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress and a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He is the author of The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, and is the co-editor of After the Ottomans, Genocide's Long Shadow and Armenian Resilience from last year, and the forthcoming I.B. Torres Handbook of the Late Ottoman Empire, History and Legacy. He's published articles and book chapters in many books and journals. He serves as the editor of the peer-reviewed journal, The Armenian Review, and is a member of the Nasser Board of Directors and its Academic Advisory Committee, and we keep him as busy as possible. A reminder, if you're watching on Zoom, please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit questions, whereas if you are here in person, please come up to the microphone at the end of the talk, if you are able to, so that all can hear you, especially people online. Please welcome Khatchig Mouradian. It's all yours, sir.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I will dive right in, and somewhere along the way, I will have a few words about Shushan as well. Using a map of a village households before everyone was deported or killed during the 1915 Armenian genocide, we navigated the streets of Havav in Kovanjalar, modern-day Turkey, and stopped at a door. A few pairs of worn-out sandals were neatly lined up nearby. The memory map, hand-drawn in New York in 1966, identified the modest house as my friend's great-grandparents' home. A third-generation Armenian American, and the first in the family to set foot in his ancestral village since the genocide, he froze in front of that humble abode and wept. Moments such as this, frequent as they have been during visits to historically Armenian-populated areas that are now within the borders of Turkey, remain etched in my memory. On these research trips and pilgrimages, we are often guided, as we were in Havav, by Houshamadeans, literally memory books, repositories of the history, geography, and ethnography of ancestral hearths lost to genocide and exile. The displaced do not build new homes. They reenact old ones. The expropriation and deportation of the Armenians from their ancestral homeland in Ottoman Turkey during the First World War, the accompanying massacres and deprivations that killed up to 1.5 million, and the subsequent systematic erasure of thousands of cultural heritage sites that left behind a devastated land and a decimated nation, reeling in exile. And as the displaced reassembled, shattered communities and lives in tatters, the longing for home seeped into their labor and often defined it. The literary genre of memory book was born out of the survivor's angst to inculcate in the next generation, who had never seen the old country, the same yearning for those inaccessible geographies tucked behind the borders of the Republic of Turkey. In the introduction to his memory book on Sis, modern-day Kozan in Turkey, Misa Kelesyan writes, "Another decade or two, with the disappearance of the elders who remember our birthplace, narrators of its beauty will no longer exist. And our children and grandchildren, headed in a direction away from homeland and memory, left to the mercy of the wings of fortune, surrendered to the all-consuming floods of foreign shores, would have to prepare for the permanent loss of traditions. Consumed by the aim of preempting this horrible disaster, we got to work and made an effort to instill among Armenians, and particularly among people of Sis, the love of their birthplace." End of quote. In her book, The Generation of Post-Memory, scholar Marianne Hirsch observes, "To grow up with overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth, is to risk having one's own life displaced, even evacuated by our ancestors. End of quote. Children of Armenian survivors found themselves in a similar predicament as they grew up in Beirut, Paris, and New York, entangled in stories of a bygone life in their ancestral homes and personal accounts of Medzierern, the Great Crime. Although decidedly an offspring of the 1915 genocide, the memory book draws inspiration from regional histories published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including works about places like Zeytun that captured the imagination of Armenian nation with their resilience and resistance against centralized Ottoman authority and oppression in the 19th century. The genre took shape in the post-genocide exilic life of the 1920s and 1930s, and within a few decades, the Armenian memory book, Houshamadean, had already become a noticeable phenomenon in the diaspora, in the words of the author of one such book on the town of Tomarza, published in 1959. A few words about how this genre sort of picked up. Historian Arshak Alboyadjan's two-volume, 2,500-page opus, Batmutyun Hayot Gesario, History of the Armenians of Gesaria, Kayseri, was a genre-defining early Houshamadean that for decades served as a source of envy, inspiration, and emulation. The book was published in 1937 in Cairo. In an effusive review that appeared the same year in the journal Sion, the then Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem, himself a prolific and established author and researcher, lauded the work for, quote, reviving the dead past and reassembling a scattered present, end quote. He called for publishing such histories of all Armenian populated towns and villages lost to the genocide. We need one of these for our own discussions, cascaded across the hundreds of Armenian compatriotic unions in the diaspora, created by and for Armenian exiles from specific villages, towns, and regions. One cannot overestimate the enormous engagement, interest, and sort of envy that some of these early works engendered as communities, compatriotic unions from different towns and villages wanted to have one of their own as well represented, one such book. The genre became an enterprise. Meanwhile, Alboyadjan himself wrote two more memory books, one on Malatya and another on Tokat, had to turn down a request for producing a few others. We hear about this in the introductions of several other volumes. He wrote the introduction for a few, and is either credited as the inspiration for or is referenced in many others. Compiling these volumes often requires years of research and outreach. Authors and editors pored over medieval Armenian manuscripts, history books, newspapers, articles, and maps. They interviewed elders and solicited written accounts by mail and through ads in newspapers. The effort took a toll. And I'm quoting here from Antoine Pouladian, who edited a volume on Arabgir. He says, "Sometimes I had to read an entire volume to prepare a one-page biography." He adds, "Let me say, however, that it was easier to concern oneself with the dead than the living. For example, to receive the biography of a teacher living in Syria, I wrote 3 letters and received it after 4 years." End quote. Not all memory book authors and editors were prolific historians and journalists like Alboyadjan and Pouladian. Many of them hadn't published much else and embarked on their journey of writing a memory book, armed with little more than a passion for their native village or town. They often disclosed their shortcomings outright and hoped to make up for what the book lacked in structure, cohesion, and scholarly rigor with the mortar of raw authenticity that embraced its bricks. Others complained about their inability to access sources or visit the towns they were recreating. Mistakes are inevitable, the author of a memory book lamented, because the work was written, quote, 47 years after the exodus from Kilis, a town in modern-day Turkey bordering Syria, when much information and many valuable documents are forever lost, end of quote. A most moving acknowledgement of limitations adorns the introduction to the memory book on the village of Tsitor in the Garin, Erzurum region. The editor, Vartiter Kocholosyan Hovannisyan, she's one of the very few women who edited memorial books or wrote memorial books, expresses hope that the reader will approach the work with understanding, noting that despite their enthusiasm, most contributors hesitated to accept the invitation to write because, and I quote, for known reasons, they have received little or no education or are self-taught. But, she continues, their national consciousness overpowered their feelings of inadequacy. And, I'm quoting again, with modesty and shaking hands, they picked up the pen. What an inspiring and at the same time heart-wrenching phenomenon. An expression of an Armenian person's, especially an Armenian villager's venerated virtue of offering their life, their soul, their possessions, and even from what they do not possess. And so, she concludes in the introduction, like my father often says, these are her words, willy-nilly we joined the caravan with a limping donkey. The result, a magisterial 364-page memory book published in Beirut in 1972, complete with a mental map of the village, a list of its pre-genocide inhabitants, and another of the descendants of the survivors. The latter also details each person's professions and where in exile they settled. So, limping or not, the published memory books are often success stories against massive odds. Wars and conflicts, most notably World War II, disagreements among compatriotic unions and commissioned authors, as you can imagine, and personal circumstances sometimes delayed or even capsized memory book projects. Some authors, like those of the memory books on Kilis and Bardizak Bahçecik, respectively, became very ill or died prior to the project's completion. And the compatriotic union had to find another editor. In a number of cases, including the 2-volume work on Sepastia, Sivas, a memory book on Hüseynik, Ulukent, now a neighborhood of Elazığ, and a third one on Tomarza, the principal authors or editors took pride in completing the project despite their advanced age. In the Sepastia case, the journey from conception to completion took 32 years. The author who finally ushered the book to the finish line wrote that he must have survived the genocide for this very purpose. It must have been his way of coping with survivor's guilt. Some 300 published titles, alongside many unpublished ones, and specialized periodicals dedicated to the Armenian populated regions, towns, or villages in the former Ottoman Empire were thus produced in the decades after the genocide, primarily in Armenian. Again, one cannot overstate how significant this drive was. What we have in published form is a fraction of what is out there. Some of these memory books that were not published were entirely dedicated to towns, and therefore there were biographies of these towns and villages. Others were memoirs of the survivor, as well as a memory book of the town and village. And drawers, shelves of families around the world are full of accounts such as this, from some that are just a few dozen pages to others that are hundreds of pages. They offer a window into the history, demography, culture, folklore, art, literature, photography, religion, politics, customs, genealogy, trades, crafts, and flora and fauna in the regions they cover. Similar to, but predating, Yizkor books published in the aftermath of the Holocaust, or histories of Palestinian villages destroyed during the Nakba, Armenian memory books present accounts of the genocide in the regions they cover, explore its legacies, and document the rebuilding of exilic communities. These books constitute a tremendous resource for scholars in the fields such as history, ethnography, geography, natural history, cartography, demography, genealogy, and art. Mapping the geographical distribution of villages and towns that have dedicated Houshamadeans would dot the length and breadth of modern-day Turkey, from Smyrna, Izmir, to Giresun, from the coastal town of Giresun to the entire Pontus region on the Black Sea, to dozens of towns and villages near the Syrian border and on the Mediterranean. The exilic communities where Armenian memory books were published span continents. They include Los Angeles, Detroit, Boston, New York, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Bucharest, Plovdiv, Vienna, Paris, Marseille, Lyon, you get the point. And a closer look reveals, however, that the United States, France, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, important 20th century publishing centers of the Armenian diaspora, produced the lion's share of memorial books. The United States and Lebanon have carried this distinction into the 21st century. Memory books and yearbooks dedicated to Kharpert and its surrounding archipelago of towns and villages would easily fill a shelf or two. Kharpert is identified as modern-day Elazar at the top. The village of Pazmashen alone, with an Armenian population of about 1,500, is memorialized in at least 2 books, both published in Massachusetts in 1930. Even tiny villages sometimes have entire volumes dedicated to them. Ohu, Bulgurjuk, a village in the region of Palu, comprises a mere 25 households before World War I, yet one of its villagers wrote a 181-page memory book about it. The city of Aintab, home to a thriving and diverse Armenian population of about 30,000 prior to the genocide, boasts half a dozen memory books, including the 2-volume, 2,000-page Batmutun Antebi Hayots by Kevork Sarafian, History of Aintab Armenians, a renowned educator, and the 327-page English language version. Now, the memory book had to safeguard what was salvaged and recreate what was lost with an authenticity that authors hoped would allow returnees to one day pick up where their ancestors had left off. Manuk Cizmecian, the author of a memory book on Kharpert, entreats his readers not to forget the town which awaits, and I quote, its children scattered around the world to return, rebuild, and make it flourish for the benefit of civilization, end of quote. All senses needed to be engaged. Authors went to great lengths to describe the vernacular, as well as the sights, the sounds, and scents of the region. The overwhelming majority of memory books include glossaries and chapters dedicated to the local dialects, expressions, and sayings. Toros Madakhjan's Houshamadean Tomarzai, memory book of Tomarza, for example, features a 50-page dictionary. Kalus Trumenian's memory book on Yerzenga, Erzincan, for instance, dedicates a section to the region's climate, even describing the features of the air people breathed, in hopes that the reader, too, could vicariously take in the air of the lost homeland. In the foreword to his father's memory book on the village of Huseinik, Dr. Hagop Martin Derenian writes, "This book has allowed me to turn back the clock and walk the streets of Huseinik vicariously, to smell its abundant and fragrant flowers, to drink from the cool and refreshing waters of Set Chasem Spring, to hear the melodious choir of St. Varvar Church, to be moved by Pastor Andreasyan's intelligent sermons, and to be terrified beyond description by the events of June 1915. Authors often employ tools other than the written word. Many thousands of photographs, detailed sketches and drawings, sheet music of folk songs, genealogy charts, and various types of maps are the collective legacy of these volumes. Mouradian's work on Arapgir features some 50 pages of sheet music. Manuk Dzevon's memory book on the village of Parchanj in the Kharpert region features dozens of sketches depicting village life, games, tools, utensils, and other objects, in addition to a plethora of maps, floor plans, extensive genealogy charts, and photographs. Published in Armenian Boston in 1938 and in English in Fresno in 1984, the book is a veritable work of art and artifact. Now, some authors were brutally honest about the good, the bad, and the downright ugly in the old country. In his memory book on Bardizag, Bahjajik, Krikor Mukhalian writes about betrayal, intrigue, corruption, and conflict among members of the clergy in a town, and delves into what he refers to as seedy traditions and unhygienic practices. Here's a striking example of the latter. The bathrooms were badly and inconveniently constructed. Behind or on the flank of the house, somewhere away from sight, there were narrow and long passageways, wooden floored, at the deep end of which was a circular or triangular opening on the floor that looked at the bottom, fully exposed, no gutter. All around the village, the narrow alleyways, human waste piled up over days, sometimes months, and smelled. Passers-by held their nose from the stench, and the air inside the houses didn't remain clean either. People waited for torrential rain to carry away the waste. A bag over their heads, men would, under the torrential rain, often employ hose to assist the streams of water to complete the cleaning, end of quote. But most memory books err on the side of romanticizing, hyperbole, and window dressing. They often portray an immaculate, idyllic world that was torn away from its native people. John Didion writes, "A place belongs forever to whoever claims it hardest, remembers it most obsessively, wrenches it from itself, shapes it, renders it, loves it so radically that he remakes it in his own image." End of quote. In many Armenian memory books, one can read between the lines the author telling the genocide perpetrators, "You take away our homeland? Watch us remake it into the best possible version of itself and of ourselves." In the introduction to his monumental work on Gesaria, Alboyadjian likens the memory book to the ornate urn carrying the remains of one's ancestors, arguing that every Armenian from the region, whether or not they can read the language, will want to have a book in their home. In the Sis Kozan volume, the reader is invited to, quote, accept the book as a necessary ornament on their bedside, end quote. And while today many Armenians treat memory books as precious artifacts connecting families to a lost homeland, much like the home key does for a generation of Palestinians who lost their ancestral homes during the Nakba, those who find it difficult to secure copies of out-of-print memorial books or find the language inaccessible have a wealth of options. In recent years, the Armenian Catholic Society in Cilicia and Lebanon has reprinted many memory books, each with a comprehensive index that earlier editions lacked. The Library of Congress and other institutions, like Nasser, hold extensive collections of published Houshamadeans and several unpublished ones. Thanks to the efforts of Shushan Yeni-Komshian Teager, a proud Aintab Armenian, the Nasser Mardiganian Mouradian Library now boasts a dedicated room for memory books. One can also download digital copies of some of these works free of charge from the National Library of Armenia's website. An increasing number of memory books are now available in English, including Mikhailan's Bardizak and its inhabitants referenced earlier. Lost Paradise, Memories of a Land and Its People, and Tadem, My Father's Village, extinguished during the 1915 Armenian genocide. Moreover, the Houshamadean project to reconstruct Ottoman Armenian life richly draws from memory books to offer resources on Armenian populated regions of the Ottoman Empire in Armenian, English, and Turkish. Houshamadean has been, for the past several years now, an absolute beacon for those looking for information about their culture and heritage in the ancestral towns and villages across the Ottoman Empire, and an inspiration to many. As more Armenians make pilgrimages to their ancestral towns, now in Turkey, the memory book leaves the shelf or the bedside and makes the journey back home with them. Meanwhile, from New York to London to Beirut, Armenian youth are embracing the culture and rituals of their ancestral villages and towns, places last inhabited by their great-grandparents. In 2023, I received an email from an Armenian-American couple. "We are getting married this summer," they wrote, "and we'd like our ceremony to reflect the traditions of the towns our ancestors hail from, Gesaria and Dikvanagert. Can you assist us with resources?" I identified relevant pages from memory books dedicated to the two cities and sent them the scans. My heart was full. In many ways, our ancestors' journey of return and reclamation is very much alive. In the immediate aftermath of the 44-day war in Artsakh in 2020, tens of thousands of Armenians were forced to leave their homes behind in territory ceded to Azerbaijan. One family decided to take their home with them. The image of the small house mounted on a truck on a highway out of Nagorno-Karabakh embodies the experiences that gave birth to the memory book. For countless refugees and migrants across the globe, carrying their home with them is not an option, but they do carry much that is intangible. They cling to it, cherish it, and claim it. They strive in their own way to recreate home away from home. This talk is dedicated to them. Thank you.
You don't have to leave. Is this on? How about now? We welcome your questions. Again, if you're in the room, please come on up to the microphone. If you're online, please use the Zoom Q&A function. And I just wanted to ask you, Khatchig, in Dan's remarks, he spoke about heart. And these books seem to me to have a lot of heart. They are not cold academic works, not that academic works are necessarily cold, but they're overflowing with personality and life and happiness and sadness. They seem to possess a lot of what we would call heart. And in our collection here at Nasser, it's the one area in the library where, because space is at a premium in any library, we can't keep endless duplicate copies of most books. But in the Houshamadean room, in Shushan's corner, there are many copies of some of the books because they seem to represent the lives and the hearts of the people who owned them. So I would just want to ask you to talk about the sort of style of these books, that they're kind of hybrid works and have a certain personality. Could you talk about that?
I think personality is the word for it, right? In many ways, each one of these works is absolutely unique. And you can see it, and the uniqueness. What is personality? It is the imperfections that makes one who they are, right? And in many ways, these works are imperfect in different ways. And these imperfections sort of are what makes this one reason why exploring these works and studying them and reflecting on them makes them so meaningful. The other way in which the personalities come through is just like any personality, it is also a reaction to other personalities. And this too comes across in many of these memory books, right? As I mentioned, there are several memory books dedicated to the same village, right? That's because someone didn't like the way the other person wrote about it. And that, and you see that, right? You have this really effort that, to sort of recreate something in a time when, the only way, with technological advancements nowadays, there are different ways in which one can sort of create a model of something that is endangered or even in ruins, right? Back then, these books were the only way to do it, right? Cramming as much information and as much heart and personality that you can almost feel like, if I read this whole thing, I will be transported back into that land. That is the intention. And this means that there is heart, there is personality, but ultimately the effort is not about saying, me, and look at all the things I know. It is about, this is the biography of this city, and let me do everything possible to make it come alive, come to life. And I do think that the works that do succeed are the ones that are, accomplish that. And that is one way to perhaps evaluate memory books beyond their scholarly merit. And they certainly do have tremendous, untapped scholarly merits.
Question from online from Greg Aftandilian. Thank you, Greg. Many Armenian letters in the pre-genocide period note the oppressive taxation imposed on Armenian villagers by Ottoman authorities. Do these memory books speak of this oppression, or do they mostly portray a kind of idyllic life before the genocide?
Thank you. You said Gregory Aftandilian. So Dr. Aftandilian gave a talk at the Middle Eastern Studies Association conference recently. I believe it was last year, and he told a story that very much stayed with me. So I think it's his grandfather who always used to lament that the fruits and the vegetables in the old country are wonderful, and everything here in America is just worthless, right? And the expression apparently which he used was, we wouldn't feed this to our animals back in the old country. Right? So there is that idyllic, to go back to his question, I just had to tell that story, but there is that idyllic narrative in a lot of places. But certainly, there's also the whole reason why this sort of genre develops is the genocide and the loss of the homeland. And so the depredations that in the decades leading up to the genocide are documented at length. The massacres, the taxation, the double taxation, the economic challenges, the early waves of an exodus. All of that is documented. One of the things that sort of brings together many of these, I was saying something about how the personality of these works is the differences and the imperfections of the authors. There's perhaps a few things that really sort of are very similar in many of these works. And it is the way in which they describe the destruction and the loss, right? It's this world that is very diverse, beautiful, and then it comes crashing down and is sort of, this destruction has some kind of equalizing effect, right? Everything is in ruin. Everything is lost. And that is where a lot of these memory books actually meet, in that point of destruction. But that's not where these stories end, right? These stories end with revival, and revival manifests itself in different ways. Rebuilding communities in the diaspora, taking pride in every single person who graduates from prominent universities, every doctor, every lawyer, and you name it, right? And so this effort to rebuild is also manifested in that regard. Or creating towns with the same name in Soviet Armenia, or neighborhoods in different parts of the diaspora. All of this is sort of, again, saying that, you couldn't destroy us. You could not, take us out. And that is also, I think, critical. So there is that, on the one hand, that you feel the oppressive environment. You also feel the effort to create an idyllic world. There's this point when everything comes crashing down and everything is sort of becomes the same, right? Ruin and destruction, and then the ways in which the communities are rebuilt.
Question from our friend Alan Whitehorn in Canada. Hello again, Alan. Thoughtful and moving presentation. In your frequency table of decade of publications, the 1960s decade was a peak. Do you see this as primarily due to the 50th anniversary of the genocide?
So just to give an overview, these publications begin in the 1920s, and they're published in the Americas, Europe, and the Middle East primarily. 1930s, 1940s, we see the numbers going up. World War II is a critical point. A lot of projects are stopped at that point, right? So there are a couple of reasons why 1960s, 1950s, and then typically 1960s are a period when you have a large number of memory books being published. One is the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and the second is that a lot of these projects that have already been initiated, that have been stopped due to World War II, pick up again in the 1950s, and they culminate in the 50s, and then more so in the 1960s. As I mentioned, some of these projects took years and years. It's frustrating because in some cases in the introductions, you read about how, we talked to this guy and he promised he's going to do it, and then 5 years passed and he didn't do it. So at some point we had to just tell him, you know what, forget about it. And I had to find someone else. And there was this angst, right? And this feeling that, look, everybody else is creating, memory books about their own towns and villages, and we still haven't, and we have failed, and things like that. And it was an issue of pride, right? How could we not accomplish this? So it peaks in the 1960s, and it remains high into the 70s and 80s, although clearly you do see the numbers going down. I have to say that the numbers I've looked at are not, more than 300 memory books that are published. I'm a little more selective. I've only selected the ones that are published after the Armenian genocide. I've selected the ones that are dedicated to towns and villages and are not quasi-memoirs. I have not included Houshamadeans dedicated to schools, other institutions, churches. I have not included family histories. There's a lot of them, right? And so if you really put together all of this, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of published ones and many hundreds more unpublished works.
Which leads to another couple of questions which get to this point. Is there a definitive list? Is there an inventory of these? And, how many would you say there are? I guess you just said.
So the most easily accessible and the best list in certainly in English, but also in general, I believe, is a bibliography of memorial books prepared, which is available on the Houshamadean website. And Mihran Minasyan prepared this bibliography, and it is, I would say, quite exhaustive. This bibliography does not include unpublished manuscripts. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to prepare a bibliography of that. It may be possible to do that for the ones that are housed in institutions and museums and libraries in Armenia and beyond. But there's a lot more that is also in private collections. These are not minor, insignificant works. Some of them are in the hundreds of pages and really offer they add tremendous value to our understanding of regions. One example is Pilibos Kazanjan's memory book dedicated to Kharpert and its surrounding villages, which is with the family. And a massive resource. Houshamadean has done sort of a summary of that manuscript. But there are many others. The one by Nerses Sukiasyan of the village of Behesni at the Library of Congress is another example. Hundreds of pages, extremely valuable for historians and scholars and people who hail from a particular part of the Ottoman Empire.
Joe, are you just going for a walk, or do you have a question?
Visiting a number of villages, small villages, I've met people that are described as village historian. They may not be formally trained, who have written village histories. And quite often they offer me a book of their village history, and I am reluctant to take it because it's the last one in the village. They published these histories, maybe 10 or 20 as their finances permitted. And especially in these small villages, many of the youth are leaving. So what's going to happen to the history after the village no longer exists, or the village is essentially an old age home? Where is there, and in other instances, I hear oral histories of the village, and visiting these villages for maybe 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 hours, it's impossible to capture this information and so forth. Is there any effort, either in Armenia or outside of Armenia, to capture these village histories? And I have a number of encyclopedias. If the village is in the encyclopedia, it gives population statistics and the weather and the altitude, but not a village history per se. So is anything being done about this, either in Armenia or outside?
There is some scholarship that I have seen on the subject, but I do not, unless there's certain projects going on right now that I'm unaware of, I do not think there's anything that is really trying to sustain these histories, right? Perhaps I can say that, in many ways, we appreciate things after they are gone, right? And, this whole genre of literature is largely a product of something that was lost. And without that loss, right, it's difficult to imagine it existing, even in terms of trying to document everything, right, and learn and appreciate. So in many ways, and that's true about our appreciation. I've often, in a little bit of a self-critical approach, right, I've often felt that, as I travel to these, Western towns and villages in Western Armenia today, in part of Turkey, and the kind of feeling I get from these ruined churches, right, and the intensity of the emotion, right, when I talk to the locals there, right, is overwhelming. And I think about this sometimes. I think about the fact that when I go to church and I talk to the congregation or the priest, I take it for granted. And we do, and we have lost tremendous amounts of, important, historical information, precisely because of this taking for granted, I think. This is not to say that memory books themselves are being preserved and maintained by the families. A lot of these books, some of the descendants can't even read the language, and they just get rid of them. Particularly the manuscripts; those are the ones that are critical, right? And so that is another issue. So we do have that.
What should they do with them, Khatchig?
Well, bring them to Nasser. I do think it is. Here's the thing, right? I do think it is important first to appreciate and understand the value and meaning of these artifacts and roadmaps for the people who created them. And anyone here who follows what's going on in Palestine, who follows what's going on in Ukraine, follows what's going on in any other part of the world, in Syria, right, where people lose everything. Entire neighborhoods are razed to the ground, right? And there's this effort to preserve and maintain and rebuild, right? This is what, through photographs and all that technology offers today. These books were all our ancestors had to accomplish that. And as I said, this is just a fraction of what they have produced. Now, it doesn't mean that, all of these manuscripts should be printed because, that's a tremendous expense and there isn't enough, interest in actually, every single volume. But for purposes of research, for purposes of learning about our history, about the past, about the present, right? And for global history. You would be amazed. One of my current projects actually looks at these works in comparative perspective, particularly the ones dedicated to the Holocaust and the Palestinian Nakba. And you would be amazed at the similarities. There are these village histories with memory maps and from by Palestinians who just lost their village. Their village was destroyed and they could never go back. Same kind of angst, same kind of experiences. And there is a great world history of memory books that awaits to be written one day. There has been recently the Diaspora, the Journal of Transnational Studies, published a special issue with 3 or 4 case studies. But this is a massive and sort of opportunity to explore what home means to us human beings and the kind of transformative power of that feeling and longing for home in people's lives.
For books, this is from Dr. Nick Hakulian. Hi, Nick. For books not yet translated, like Al-Boyajian's, are there efforts, means to have them translated? This is a popular question when this topic comes up.
Yes, so I am happy to say that some such initiatives are currently underway. George Arjayan has initiated a project to translate all the books on Palu, and that is in progress already. There are efforts, there are publications of memorial books in different contexts as well. It's difficult to imagine the translation of 2,500-page books, right? Houshamadean does an invaluable favor to the community, service to the community, by providing summaries or focusing on specific, towns and villages, or specific like arts and crafts, religious traditions, customs, etc. But there's a lot more out there, and I think ultimately in the age of AI, and perhaps this is important for this question, there will be a time when we will be able to have all these memorial books in digital format in a database. It will be easy to translate them from one language to the other through artificial intelligence, and they will be easily searchable. So I'm not one who would advocate for let's translate everything and print them and publish them, because I realize that it's not something that's going to suddenly be on the New York Times bestsellers list when it comes out. But on the other hand, I do think that technology is giving us new tools of visiting home and recreating home in different ways.
It's a suggestion here from Khatchig Mouradian. Has anyone tried to merge these different works into a single well-produced documentary, which is actually kind of a fascinating concept, because they are, some of them, very visual, as you pointed out.
Yes, there are some documentaries, but not entirely dedicated to the memory book as much as visiting the ancestral home, where the memory book plays some kind of role. There are no documentaries dedicated to the memory book per se, or sort of bringing a city to life through a documentary kind of thing. There are similar efforts in other, in cinema. This is not a foreign concept, but in the case of our reality, it doesn't exist.
From Dr. Robert Myrak pointing out that I think he's correct that at least 20 or more years ago, Professor James Russell was one of the first to really call attention to the academic research value of these books. Why do you think it took so long for them to become the subject of academic interest and activity?
I do think that for important constituencies, it was discovered later. For example, for scholars of Ottoman history, right? Few scholars who worked on, Ottoman history knew Armenian to begin with, right? That has changed in recent years. So that's one. So there is increased interest in materials that are not in Ottoman Turkish, and this was certainly part of it. There have been, and it's important to note, I did not mention, several of these books have been translated to Turkish in the past 2 decades. That's another important phenomenon. In our reality, I think much of the scholarship has focused on the genocide, and much of what has been sort of explored in that scholarship has had a certain kind of focus on what can be, from the perspective of a lawyer, right? The pioneers of genocide scholarship have worked to document the destruction of the Armenian genocide through a particular perspective that wanted to prove it, wanted to give a sense of the scope of the loss. So in that regard, these materials have been used. But beyond that, they haven't. I think that, and this is very telling, because we also see this in oral histories, by the way. In oral histories, I'm often frustrated with oral history recordings where you have valuable information about the history, about the history or customs of a town in the Ottoman Empire, in Armenian town that is being discussed. The survivor is talking about it. And the interviewer will say something like, tell us about the massacres, tell us about the massacres, right? And I'm thinking, just let the woman talk. It's so you have this kind of approach that for a long time created two worlds. One was our world where we wanted to keep and recreate, etc., and the other was the world outside. And for that, you were, the prosecutor, and things that did not really serve that purpose received less attention.
Dr. Alan Odion points out that a variant of the memory book was a series of volumes published by Richard Hovhanessian based on the UCLA conferences, which I think is entirely right. Yeah. Yes.
The difference, of course, is that those are scholarly works, right? Yeah. In a way that, the driving force for a lot of these memory books is this kind of, let's collect as much as possible for the Richard Hovhannissians of the future. And they will say this. They will say, I'm not a historian, but my effort is to save and preserve as much as possible for the future historian. And so the series that was, a Richard series, let's call it, right, is a product of this. But I would say it's a different kind of item, historical document.
And the last question, which I think brings together everything that we've covered tonight, from Nazali Dolgarmadjian. I came by Shushan Teager through her piece, Armenian Women Lost in Obscurity, published in the Journal of Armenian Studies in 2002, which was one of the first pieces I read that pointed out that as heroic and treasured as our materials on Armenian history are, there are still narratives that miss important people in our history, namely women, who played crucial roles in Armenia's identity as a Christian nation. With that in mind, what would you say these village histories do not capture or cannot capture? What do they prioritize, and whose voices do they amplify? And thank you for that excellent question.
It is an excellent question, and perhaps one thing I can focus on is the role of women. And let me give you a few examples. So one of the projects that I've been working on is based on the diaries and accounts and ledgers of two midwives who served as midwives in Aintab, beginning in 1888. They're two sisters, Armenian, and then all the way into the 1940s. They document some 8,000 births that they officiated, babies that they delivered. The families, family members, it's true. Initially in Aintab and then in Aleppo after they are forced out of Aintab. Now, in memory books dedicated to Aintab, these two sisters are not mentioned. They have family members who've become doctors, real doctors, quote unquote, right? And you see pages and pages about them, right? So in many ways, there are, there's this sense of, in this revival period, right? There's a sense of being proud in our doctors who are going to Yale and getting degrees, right? But these two sisters, just one example, who single-handedly, I have a photograph that a friend has shared with me of an extended family, 3 generations. Almost every single person in that picture was delivered by one of these two women, right? But they don't exist. I have to look for a line here, a reference there, etc., and interviews to add to the massive material that they have in order to be able to tell their story. This is tremendous erasure without even realizing the value of this, right? Now we do, but how do you go back and reconstruct that when the memory book itself has not deemed it important enough, right? You don't read anything about the midwives, about the nurses of the period at all. Mostly women, right, in these memory books. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, overwhelmingly, with very rare exceptions, these are books written and published by men.
So let me just make a pitch then. If you do have these books in your home and you don't know what to do with them, or manuscript materials relating to these books and you don't know what to do with them, we're not trying to take your treasures from you. But if you don't know what to do with them, there are responsible organizations such as Nasser and other libraries and archives and institutions that will cherish these materials and do cherish them. So please let such materials never be simply lost. There are institutions and libraries that will take them in and care for them. So please, if you're not sure what you have, contact Khatchig, contact me, contact Ani Babayan, contact your local Armenologist, and they will take a look at it for you.
And may I add something to this,
Please.
Mark? I think that even if you want to hang on to these documents, right, I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to give a library a digital copy.
Agreed.
Because someone down the line in the family will not want to hang on to it, or something is going to happen to it, right? So if you have it now, you don't have to give it to me or to Mark. Just make sure there's a copy of it, digital copy of it available, and it's, that can be accessible to researchers to do work on these materials.
Indeed. A reminder, if you're here in person, there is a reception and there are refreshments after the program. Another reminder, if you are an ASSER member, you may be a winner tomorrow of a copy of Khatchig's wonderful book, The Resistance Network. So please sign up to win or become a member if you are not a member. It's a good idea to become an ASSER member anyway. We need your support, and we want your support, and we appreciate your support. We would like your feedback as well. If you have any comments about this or any other NASR program anytime, contact us. Be nice. And now please applaud for Khatchig Mouradian. And likewise for Dan Teager and for our dear friend Shushan Teager, who will always be remembered here.